So we have a small group with us today, which we sort of knew would happen for the live broadcast because this is just a really tough time with people's schedules. So I'm not only speaking to those of you who are joining me live, but speaking to the recorded audience. And for those of you who don't know, I'm Amy Getz from the Charles A. Dana Center. If you were not at the workshop that we had a couple of weeks ago, the purpose of this webinar is to provide additional information and build upon what we did in the last workshop. And so we're going to get started here. And actually, Jeff is not joining me today because we had a small group. He is leaving today to go do a training in Dallas, so he's going to hit the road. Okay, so we are going to, today we're going to just do a very, very quick overview of Math Pathways, and that is mostly for people that will be viewing this that were not at our workshops. And then we're going to focus on three subject areas that were identified by the people who were at our workshop. First is roles and responsibilities of faculty and staff in implementation, how to promote pathways with students, faculty, and staff, and then some more discussion about quantitative reasoning course design. And as Marco said, please feel free to submit questions at any time. I'll decide, I may wait a little while to address them, but I'll try to make sure I get to any questions. And I do just want to mention that one other thing that came out of the workshop that people were interested in more information about was our Dana Center courses. It wasn't in the top three, so I couldn't include it in this webinar, but I did send out a doodle poll asking for responses from people who were interested in us doing another webinar on that topic. So if you are watching this live and you did not see that poll and are interested, you might want to respond to that. Okay, so this quick review. What is a math pathway? So we talk about this concept of a mathematics pathway as a way to re-envision how we think about mathematics courses. So the pathway is the sequence of courses that students take from their very first math course to their final math course that meets the requirements for their program of study. So that could be just one course for some students, depending on their program and where they come in. We at the Dana Center, our work centers around the New Mathways project, through which we advocate for a small set of differentiated pathways that align to programs of study. So this concept of the math pathway, it really is trying to help people change their perspective about how they think about math programs. So the term pathway, which is used in a lot of different ways, in this case, we like it because it provides this metaphor that helps us think about three critical questions. Where and how do students enter a pathway, which gets people to thinking about who those students are, how they get placed into pathways or advised into pathways. What is the experience in the pathway, which is really important for students that are going to have multiple courses, because we want people on in faculty and staff to start thinking about courses in terms of a coherent and consistent experience for students. And then where do students go after they exit the pathway, and how do they get onto their next pathway that is hopefully getting them towards their completion of their certificate or degree. So it's really important that this be seen as systemic work and cross-institutional work. I have seen examples in many colleges where math departments working alone are able to implement small-scale versions of pathways, but I have never seen a single example of an institution that did pathways at scale if they only had the math department working on it. So you can quote me on that if you need to make that case to others, but it's really important that you have cross-institutional collaboration. And that leads us to this idea of roles and responsibilities. So we strongly recommend that there be a small leadership team that crosses a number of stakeholder groups and supports the work over a period of a couple of years. So I'm going to talk about the groups that are listed on the screen right now. And just a note, you'll also notice at the bottom that occasionally there are these references to the NMP implementation guide. And NMP is the New Mathways Project. For people that were at the workshop, each team got a copy of the implementation guide, and there's also a link on our website for a free download, and we'll look at that later. So these are references of places you might look at the guide for more information and more detailed advice. So we will start with talking about the math faculty. So they have a primary role of leading the design and setting the vision for the work. So the math faculty should be leading this. And some of this is fairly obvious. They need to design the pathways. They've got to get those courses approved and scheduled. And then they also need to think beyond that, that they have to communicate with and engage others, that again is across the institution. And they really need to plan for scale. And that includes faculty training and the inclusion of adjuncts, which is really, really important. And this may be where people in the math department may have less experience about planning for scale. It kind of depends on what they've done in the past. So this could be an area in which they might benefit from support and advice from others. Administrative leaders are also important in this, and as far as who this actually is, it varies depending on organizational structure. Usually we see either there's a dean or a provost or an vice president of academic affairs involved. Sometimes there is also involvement from a VP of student success or student services. So again, it kind of varies, but it's important to have at least one person in the room who sort of has some authority. And their role is to support and enable the faculty to step forward as leaders. So specifically things that they should be thinking about is sometimes like if a department chair is leading the work, that person may be relatively new to that role and may have never actually worked across the institution. So just helping them understand the processes and structures that they're working within, helping them coordinate that. Or on the other hand, you may have a department chair that has a lot of experience and may not need that kind of support. An administrator almost is always the person in the best position to look for cross-institutional connections. For example, they may know that the Achieving the Dream work is doing something that could be related to this. And so they know how to bring those people together and leverage those opportunities. It's very important for administration to clarify priorities. If this truly is a institutional priority, they need to find ways to communicate that. Finding resources, and of course that can mean money, but it can also mean other things. For example, this takes a lot of logistical planning, and it could really help a faculty leader to have some administrative assistant support to take minutes at meetings and schedule meetings and send out reminders and things like that. And then, of course, oversight is also important to just make sure things are progressing. Another stakeholder group that you may want to include are faculty for this kind of broad category of things we call student success courses. And that could include things like learning frameworks courses, first year experience or first year seminar, maybe even services like orientation, or if you have workshops for students that support student success. You wouldn't necessarily have people from all of those groups on a leadership team, but you might want to have a representative who can help advise about how to integrate what goes on in those courses and support student learning within the math courses. And there's sort of two perspectives on this. One is to support the math faculty to integrate effective learning practices into their mathematics courses. And the other is to turn that around and ask, well, what could we integrate into these other courses or services that might support the mathematics learning? And I know that it's always hard to think about in like if you're doing a general student success course, you can't integrate special material about every subject area. But since math, it does tend to be such a big obstacle for so many students, it might be worthwhile to think about how to provide some specific supports around mathematics. Okay, advising, this is probably the most important group to include, and also the most likely to be left out until too late. And I speak from seeing this happen at a lot of colleges where they leave advising out of the room too long. So the important thing is here, this isn't just about telling advisors what to do, it's engaging them and giving input because they have important information to share. So often on a leadership team, we will see like having a director of advising, or perhaps a representative from advising that has a lot of experience. And they really need to contribute to the planning, and that their responsibilities include giving input that helps everyone understand the perspective of advisors and students. Often advisors have an insight into students that faculty do not. They will help you think about how to train and support advisors, and also about what kinds of tools and materials you need to communicate with both advisors and students. Institutional research is another group that people often don't think about including in actual planning stages. And it is a little tricky because it may not be effective to have them in every single meeting, but you do want them to be involved early on and to understand what you're trying to achieve, because you will need data. You need data to understand what issues you're trying to solve right now, how many students you might be targeting. You need data on where those students are going after they leave the pathway. If you think about that entry and exit of the pathway, institutional research helps you understand that. You need data on how students are doing in your current courses, and then you'll need data about how they're progressing as you start to implement. And the reason you don't want to just wait and kind of like give the IR people a huge data request, is they have really good knowledge about how to structure data requests that most of us, and I speak from being a former faculty member, we don't understand the way their systems work. So you need somebody in there that has that perspective. The other thing that they really can bring to the whole process is helping you think about how you would communicate with that data, how to use it and communicate effectively. Um, I recently was working with a group and they brought in 14 pages of data that was in about 6-point type, and they handed it out and they gave everybody like 5 minutes to look at it, and then they said, so what do you notice, what trends do you see? And most of us were just squinting really hard trying to read it. That's an example, and we see that kind of thing a lot. So your IR people hopefully can really help you think about how to communicate effectively, and then they can also help you start thinking about your evaluation. Student support services, this is an area that's really different for every institution. So different colleges have different programs that might be working with the target populations that you're working with. So this could be like in DevEd, it could be that target population. So things like the TRIO programs. If you're looking at something that is for a certain program of study, that you have a very large program like say nursing, and there's some sort of group that works with pre-nursing students, that's a good group to connect with. Tutoring is something that kind of spans the whole group. So these are folks that can give really good input about the needs and perspectives of those students. So they're important in the planning stage, and they're also important in the implementation, like when you're actually starting to roll this out, because they have access to those students. So this is another one, maybe you don't have all of these people represented on the leadership team, but you want to make sure you're engaging with them and having some sort of two-way communication with them early on. So they can really support your uh, how you develop strategies for advising and communications, and how you can provide learning support also. And then every college is different. So you kind of want to just look around and think about who should be on the leadership team that could really add some value, and also who might just support different pieces of the work. Communications is going to be huge. You're going to be communicating with staff, faculty, and you also have to communicate with students. So anybody who has specialty skills in that area can be very useful to you. Student leaders, some of the places where you might want to get some student input. Faculty from partner disciplines, especially if you have sort of a couple dominant programs or programs that have major concerns about the mathematics, get them in there early. Anyone who's leading other special projects like a Title III grant or a QEP or an ATD project, think about whether they could be valuable partners in this. And if you have an institutional evaluator, certainly you want to have them involved in thinking about your evaluation process. Okay, so that's sort of our big first agenda item. And so we're moving on now to talking about promoting pathways. And this was a big question at the workshop as well. So first of all, you're going to see, I'm going to make lots of recommendations about stepping back and asking some general questions before you engage in anything. So first of all, the big issue is the right message for the right group at the right time. And these are just some questions you really should ask before you do any outreach. So what's really important to this group? What do they care about? What perspective and background do they bring? And what do you want them to do? So what's the action you're trying to get them to take to support this work? So let's start with students. So thinking about their concerns. We're all aware that a lot of students come in with pretty negative experiences with math. Sometimes I think we assume they have negative experiences, and that's not great because there are a lot of students who've had some pretty positive experiences. But this issue about negative past experiences or negative attitudes, it's really important to not minimize that for students or ignore it or say that's not important. We have to honor their experience, but it's also important not to try to build on their negativity. So one of the frustrating things for me in Pathways is often you see this message, maybe not this explicit, but that I have on the screen about, do you hate math? Then this is the class for you. Or things like, oh, you've had trouble in math before? Well, this is an easier class. Those are not the messages you want to give to students. First of all, they just promote those negative perceptions. They will mislead students, especially if someone is telling them that like a statistics course is easier than an algebra course. I have to say, I always thought statistics was the hardest math class I ever took, personally. You don't want to set that up. And you also don't want to be giving that message to the rest of your college community that these courses are less valuable, less rigorous. So it's just really important to turn around and have positive messaging. So things that matter to students often are saving time and money, offering a comparison of the costs of a longer pathway versus a shorter one, including things like textbooks cost. That's pretty motivating for students. Helping them understand that they might be learning math that will be more useful to them, that will be useful, and that they might have an opportunity to learn math in a different way than they've experienced before. So here's some do's. Use student-friendly language in your examples and your materials. A course description that is written for a curriculum committee is not going to speak well to students. So especially in things like quantitative reasoning courses, that is not something people understand what that means. Even statistics, a lot of students don't know what that means, but at least it's a word they've heard before. But you've got to be able to communicate with them in a way that gets the message across in a good, positive way and also makes sense. Use student testimonials. This is going to be a common theme. The student voice is the most powerful voice you have. Um, be prepared to talk to students about how the math they will be learning will be useful to them in ways that are really concrete. Um, Definitely always use multiple platforms and venues. And whenever you develop materials, get some students to look at them first and give you some input. And on the bottom of the screen here, there's a link to a really nice example of a website that does a number of these things. So when talking to faculty and staff and promoting the math pathways with them, first of all, think about the goal of inviting people into a process. So often we tend to want to just inform people, and that's important too. And it takes a lot of effort sometimes just to get people informed and keep them informed. But you don't want people just to know about what you're doing with Math Pathways. You want them to be part of that because, again, that's how you get things to scale. So always keep that in the back of your mind. And here are some things you want that I think are just helpful questions to think about as you start to approach this. What convinced you and got you excited? Now, that is not to say that you can assume that that's the same thing that will convince and excite other people, but it's kind of a nice starting point, is a place to say, oh, this is what makes me passionate. And what can be very interesting is if you have a conversation with multiple people that are sort of already excited about it, you may hear that there are different things from each one of them that got them engaged in the work. And so that can help you start to think about what are the hooks for other people. What do you think the concerns are of other people? So that's a little bit like thinking about with those students, if they've had a negative experience in the past, we need to address that, but we don't want to live in the negative place. So how could we think about turning those concerns around into positives? One of the most effective things you can do, especially if you're anticipating resistance, is start with common ground, which is almost always the student. Uh, with faculty or advisors or tutors or people in IR or people in financial aid, they all really care about students. And so if you can start there, then other things work out more easily when you keep that student front and center. And use data, again, and use it effectively. This is another thing that I think we tend to hide data from broader audiences. We use it in our little in-groups. And it's an important tool, and it helps people understand the reasons behind the work. And just some general advice: presume good intentions. There are people out there who resist change just because it's change, but most people have good reasons if they're resisting change. There's something motivating that comes from a positive place, and if you understand that and work from it, you'll be much more effective with engaging them. So I wanted to talk about common pitfalls for two groups that are the most critical in this work. And this is based on what I've heard from a lot of colleges of where they run into some problems. So again, advising, this kind of reiterates what I said before, but the common pitfalls is the telling them what without telling them why. And this gets back to using that data. Help advisors understand why your proposal for new pathways is a good idea for students. And I mean, remember, these are intelligent professionals. They would like to understand the reasons behind things. Um, Pitfall is not to ask for their input or wait too late to ask for their input. And then this last one is really important. It is, you don't want to leave them with the full responsibility for making the translation for students. So I'm going to go back to that example I used before of the course description for a curriculum committee. If you're just handing that off to advisors, especially for something around quantitative reasoning, but I'd say for statistics, well, and a lot of algebra courses too, and now the advisors, without any support from the math faculty, are supposed to sit down with students and help students make sense of that. I can almost guarantee that they will not be able to translate that in a way that math faculty would approve of. So it's really important for math faculty and advisors to jointly decide, how do we translate what we're doing to make sense to students? Okay, math faculty. Okay, I said using data is really important, and yet so often with math faculty, it feels, even if it's not intended to be this way, it feels as if the data is a weapon and it's being used to pummel the poor faculty. So if we're showing data of the progression of students through our math courses, and we're looking at how few students are getting through and how few students are successful, and that's the only way we view that data, then to math faculty who are working their rear ends off, as we all know most of our faculty do, that is very demoralizing. It's like, here I am working as hard as I know how to, and you're telling me I'm failing. But instead, what we should be saying, and I believe this from my heart, this is not trying to manipulate, I absolutely believe this, is that our faculty, our tutors, our advisors, everybody at this institution is working really hard to help students be successful. And yet our data shows that students aren't successful. And that means it's not about people working any harder, because we know we can't work harder. It means we have structures that are not supporting student success, and we have to change those structures. And that's why we're having all of you help us figure out how to change those structures. So now it's not about I'm doing a bad job. It's I'm working within structures that are preventing me from helping students in the way that I want to. So you really want to make sure that you start these conversations in a place like that and honor people's work, honor their commitment to student success. Another common pitfall, and this is so easy to fall into this, is isolating the work from the full department. So it's kind of common sense that you're starting this new course and everybody's really busy, and so you're going to assign a couple people to go work on the new courses, and so they're kind of over in the corner, and the rest of us are going to continue to conduct business as usual. The problem is that gives, first of all, the wrong signal to your other faculty. So if there's a faculty member who is not very interested in that work, maybe doesn't particularly support the work, then to them it gives the message, you get to just keep doing what you're doing and we'll let you do that. You don't have to really pay attention. If there's a faculty member who was interested but didn't get to be one of the people working on it, it says, we don't really value your input. And that's not what you want. You want, if you're going to do this at scale, you want and need everyone eventually to support the work, to be a part of it. So you need to start by setting the absolute expectation that every single faculty member, including your adjuncts or part-time, are engaged in the Math Pathways work in some way. Now, that does not mean you have to add to everybody's workload. So that might mean, all right, we are having a department meeting and we're going to look at a common article, or we're going to look at a lesson activity or a classroom video, and we are going to discuss it. And maybe that's their engagement. You can figure out different levels of engagement for people, but you want to set that expectation that nobody gets to ignore this. And hopefully then what you're going to do is you're going to build your capacity, because what happens when it's the two people working in the corner by themselves is in a year, they suddenly need more people to teach more courses, more sections, and they don't have anybody who's ready to do that. So you want to be building your capacity while you're actually building your pathways. Um, the last two bullets are really about messaging and how you talk about pathways. And this goes back, we talked about this with the students. You do not want to feed into perceptions that pathways are anti-algebra. That sets math faculty off. We don't like that. I absolutely make the case that every single math pathway will always have algebra in it. The question is, what algebra? So in a QR course, using algebraic concepts for modeling, for graphing, for using equations to make predictions, being able to solve equations. It's all very important in a QR course. Simplifying rational expressions typically is not. So it's not about we're rejecting algebra. It's about we're selecting the right amount and the right algebraic skills and concepts for the different pathways. The same goes for rigor. It's a different way of looking at rigor. It's not based on the amount of algebra. It's a different way of thinking about it. And so if you're going to make the case that we're not decreasing rigor, you probably need to be able to show some examples. And then administrators are really bad about making statements like students just need to get through math more quickly. When I hear that as a math faculty, I hear it as you think math is a hoop that students need to jump through. And that's not what I believe. So for administrators that are listening to this, please guard against this. For the rest of you, if you have administrators who are saying things like this, please just gently pull them aside and say, you really want to communicate to math faculty in a different way. So the statement I have here at the bottom is just an example of a different way to talk about math pathways that is much more friendly to math faculty. That you really want to stress that what we're trying to do is we're trying to help students learn math that is meaningful to them. We want students to be empowered by their mathematics learning. We want them walking away saying, I understood this and I see value in it. And we also want them to progress towards their academic goals more quickly. So here's some examples of engagement strategies. Now, quick comment about another pitfall. Often people get really excited about a certain strategy, and then they're like, oh, we are going to do that with everybody in every situation. And you really need to be strategic about this. Make sure you're matching your strategy with the need, what you're trying to accomplish, with kind of the time you have, where people are in their process. So like the example, teaching sample lessons, showing examples of student work or activities. This also, like maybe a classroom video. Those are all great if what you're trying to achieve is having people, like, for example, really understand the difference between a quantitative reasoning lesson versus an algebra lesson. Those are great strategies. They're also good if people are sort of fairly new into the process, or that you're trying to really get them to delve deep. So the discussions you have around these kind of activities would really vary on where people are and how much information they have. But let's say you're really trying to make the case about the rigor of a course. So looking at student work might do that, or a sample lesson might do that. But what might be even more effective would be to look at some examples that go across a course of how a mathematical concept is developed. Because sometimes it's hard to capture rigor in a single activity. But if you look at something as it develops over the course, then it becomes a more persuasive argument. So that might be a different strategy you want to use in that example. Again, student voices, so powerful. A student panel presentation, if you can get video interviews, they're great. Now, if you haven't implemented yet, you may not have students that can do that at that point. In that case, you might want to try to utilize some of your friends and colleagues around you. Look at other colleges. You could consider actually doing site visits. But if that's kind of too resource or time intensive, consider just connecting with a colleague and saying, hey, could we just do a phone interview with a couple of your students, or could we have an interview with some of the instructors? And then, and another example I didn't put in here, this is a good example of think about your audience. In some audiences, having some sort of outside expert, an external person who could come in and sort of provide some legitimacy or answer some questions from experience is really valuable. In some cases, that's like the death knell that will really make people angry. So that's another example of something where you need to think about what will work for this audience and for your purpose. A couple other activities I didn't include on the slide, but I did mention earlier something around discussion groups, something that will engage people intellectually in the ideas. Classroom observations can be effective. They can also be a little bit of a distraction, and sometimes they're just tricky to manage. So you might want to think about classroom videos if you're interested in something like that. Mostly that point at the bottom of the screen, find and support your champions. So your champions are the people who are passionate and who have the ability to communicate that passion to other people. You really need those folks. Those are the ones that are going to really move things forward for you. Okay, so I'm going to show you some examples of some materials that might support this work. We're going to go to the website in just a second, but first I want to just talk you through this, how to navigate this on your own. So we're going to look at the Dana Center website. The link is on your screen. And the tools I'm going to show you go through, the links are shown there. Higher education, you're going to resources, etc. So Marcos is going to give me access so that I can show you this on the website. Okay, so this is the Dana Center general website. So the tabs up here, or there are two places. If you go to this one, you can go down to higher education resources. Sorry, that just refreshed. And then over to NMP implementation resources. And I'm not going to go through all the link because it just takes a little too much time. So I'm going to show you, if you go again, let me just show you again. If you go to those NMP implementation resources, you will see a link to the NMP Institutional Scaling Toolkit. And you'd also see a link to our implementation guide. Okay, so this is the page for the Scaling Toolkit. And there's another link to the implementation guide. We put them everywhere, so it's easy to get to. And if you scroll down, just give some background information. I really recommend that you read the introduction. It's very short. We keep it very brief, but it just kind of help you understand what we've got. And then this readiness assessment is where we're going to go next. And it's just a hopefully quick and easy guide to help you decide what tools might be useful to you. The ones I'll just mention here, these at the top are whoa, things are moving. Sorry, the screen is moving a little bit unpredictably. Okay, these at the top here are about program and study inventory. This can be very useful if you're just in the process of trying to align your pathways to your programs of study. This one gets at what we've been talking about, creating effective advising tools. This has recommendations both for a process to use with advisors, and this is after you've made some key decisions. So notice over here, it says when you've identified your target population for pathways and set default math requirements. So you can't really create the advising tools until you know what you're advising for. But this provides some suggestions about effective communication tools, and it also has models of student, like I was talking about, student-friendly course descriptions. There are some models for that here. And then this one right here this is a nice research article on faculty orientations toward instructional reform. It's short, it's like 4 pages, very concise. It was produced by MDRC. And I mean, it's about faculty, but I think it would apply to staff too. It just kind of helps you understand how you can think about why people are reacting in the way that they are and what kind of supports they might need. And then this tool is, this is sort of a discussion tool that we developed to go along with that article that helps, it takes you through some questions that you can think about when you're thinking about how you would engage faculty to both just get engaged with the work, but also to develop leadership. And then I just want to mention this high impact practices resource. This is a list, and it really is short. It's kind of a laundry list of practices that we saw happening in colleges that seem to be particularly effective in helping colleges implement and scale pathways. So it's kind of nice to just be able to go through it and say, oh, here are 2 or 3 things we might want to make sure that we do. Okay, Marcos, I am releasing control, and you can take us back to the PowerPoint. Okay, that takes us through the portion of this that was really focused on kind of general implementation, institutional-wide. Now we're going to talk more specifically about quantitative reasoning courses. And I just realized that I forgot to mention that you will have full access not only to the recording, but to the PowerPoint and to some attachments that I'm going to be talking about in this next section. Okay. So I think that probably for most people who are watching this, this is going to be a little basic, but I just wanted to kind of start at a common place that we could generally say that QR, first of all, it's often defined as mathematics used in context, but used for a specific purpose, often described as decision making, evaluation, analysis, and almost always includes emphasis on communication. There are a lot of definitions of QR. In fact, there's a listserv I'm going to talk about later that this has been a big theme in the last 2 weeks on the listserv. So this is just trying to simplify this and give us some common ground for our discussion. So the old approach to this kind of category of the category of math through liberal arts courses were that they were kind of survey courses often, which covered lots and lots of content very quickly, or they were kind of math appreciation courses. That's what we're trying to get away from, and what leadership across the country and colleges across the country are moving towards is courses that develop deep understanding and skills in a few critical areas. So what are the kind of content areas that are usually in a quantitative reasoning course? So I'm listing 5 here. If you went and did a survey among leaders in QR, I would guess that you would pull at least 4 out of these 5 from every single person, and then maybe they'd have 1 or 2 that weren't on this list. But these are pretty common. Statistics is sort of non controversial. Everyone agrees that some level of statistics is included in quantitative reasoning. Modeling is probably your next one that is on there a lot. Um, and modeling can be very general. It can also get pretty complex. Usually it'll have linear and exponential, but sometimes getting into logarithmic modeling. I've seen a lot of different extensions of modeling concepts. Proportional reasoning. Logic is often included, although there's some pushback on some of the kind of things like just truth tables and things, because again, it's trying to use the mathematics in context. So whether that can really be done, that's what you want to try to do is make sure some of those more abstract ways that we think of logic are useful in some contextual format. And then numeracy tends to be a common theme just that goes across all content, is that there is a lot of emphasis on helping students develop estimation skills. And that's not just estimation like, estimating what 23 plus 35 is. It's estimation in terms of, so, thinking about the world population, what's a reasonable estimation for what the population might be, a projection of a population, or things like that. Now, I just want to note that just because I list all of these doesn't mean you need to do all of them. And remember that trend towards deep understanding and skills in a few areas. You don't want to try to do everything. The other thing that tends to be unique about quantitative reasoning courses is that not only is it mathematics in context, but the way the context is selected is very intentional. So often, for years in math education, we tried to present more applications of math. And, you open up a typical math textbook and there are going to be application problems, and the applications kind of jump all over. And mostly the applications are selected because they're good illustrations of the mathematical topic. Well, in QR, it's more about, okay, we want context that we think is valuable for students to learn about. So for example, the idea of the ball being thrown up in the air and trying to figure out when the ball will land, is that really in itself a valuable context for students? Now, if they're physics students and they're really, getting into understanding the motion and the gravity and forces that act upon a falling object, that might be. But if it's a student in another field, that's maybe not the most important contextual application of a quadratic function. So if we're thinking about context that is important to people to know, personal finance is just always in every QR course. I can't imagine one without it. And then some selection from these other types of contexts: civic issues, social and political issues, health literacy is growing as an emphasis in QR. So in this next section, I'm just going to talk about some steps that I would consider really important to go through in developing a quantitative reasoning course. Now, do some research and look at examples. Obviously, people are trying to do that because we keep getting requests for information about quantitative reasoning courses. So that's really good that people are looking to kind of gather some information from a variety of sources. So I want to mention the National Numeracy Network. I forgot to mention this during the workshop a couple of weeks ago. This is a professional association that promotes the concepts of quantitative reasoning across disciplines. So it's not just math people. It's a really kind of fascinating group. You get journalists, you get social scientists, people from all sorts of disciplines. They have, first of all, just on their website, they had some nice resources, but they also have a listserv that is amazing. And I strongly, strongly recommend anyone who's interested in this, these ideas, to join the NNN. They have really reasonable membership fees, and get on that listserv. they have the most interesting discussions, and people will post things like examples that they find in the media. It's a great place to look for examples for lessons. And then I learn stuff from them all the time. I did mention at the workshop the Mishmatic website. So Mishmatic did host a workshop on quantitative reasoning. I believe it was a little over a year ago. Not really, maybe not. Sometime in 2014 they did that. So on their website, they have a link that has links for references, but they also have example course documents from the Michigan colleges. And I haven't delved into any of those actual documents, but it's just a nice way to find out what other colleges are thinking about. And then things that are attached with this webinar are the course documents from the Dana Center's quantitative reasoning course. Ivy Tech Community College is the statewide community college system in Indiana, and they have made quantitative reasoning their default math class for everyone who is not a STEM major. And I think it's like 70 to 80% of their students go into quantitative reasoning. So they have their learning outcomes, and they're, anybody, if you want to connect with any of the faculty there, I'd be happy to help facilitate that. North Carolina has implemented QR as their default math course also, and they have a statewide learning outcomes. This is a little different from Ivy Tech because it has to go for more than one, it's multiple institutions. So their learning outcomes are a little more general and high level from the Ivy Tech ones. And then this Teagle Foundation framework, this is something that I just came over the National Numeracy Network listserv last week, and I thought it was really interesting. It's just a one-page, very high-level overview of quantitative reasoning, but I think it's just a nice place as a discussion starter. So I wanted to include that as well. And then step 2 is know who you are serving. This is really important. Identify the programs that you think would use a quantitative reasoning course. Start to talk to those partner disciplines. And remember, the words quantitative reasoning won't make any sense to them. Try to have concrete examples to help those discussions, help move those along. And then that can help you narrow down that content list of what's most important for the disciplines that would be using the course. Step 3. So this is all about big picture. It's not getting to the level of learning outcomes yet, but sort of just defining your overall goals, like really thinking, are you really interested in promoting communication skills, problem solving skills, your broad content areas? Then asking some hard questions about what you want to do pedagogically. This can be tough because I think most people who are really interested in QR really love the idea of a very collaborative learning environment and creating a course around that. And I absolutely advocate that. And yet I also offer a word of caution. Don't try to get into anything that you can't do at scale. So if you know that in 3 years you're going to need 20 sections of this, you need to ask, can we support faculty to teach 20 sections of this and teach it well? And then you need to think about assessment, because you have to align assessment with that pedagogy. We had an institution that had an institutional policy that I can't remember the exact percentage, but it was something like 80% of every course grade had to be based on proctored exams. Well, that doesn't work very well with a collaborative active learning based course that should probably be assessed in some different ways. And then you need to think about how technology will be used. Most QR courses do integrate technology. And all of these things matter. You need to have these discussions first, because when you get down to learning outcomes and course description, those will be impacted by the decisions you made about pedagogy, assessment, and technology. When you're writing learning outcomes, think about how you could capture the spirit versus just capturing the content. So, for example, for an algebra course, you often have something like students will be able to create a graph based on a linear equation in slope-intercept form. That could also be a learning outcome in a QR course, but a QR course is probably getting more at how they're going to use that graph and what they're going to do with that information. And again, think about messaging. Do you need different versions of descriptions that will speak to different audiences? How will you explain it to others? Okay, this issue about materials. Now, I make this sound like it's all linear. Of course, it's not linear. You're probably already looking at materials in your research phase, and that's good. But I really want math faculty to give themselves the opportunity to think about what they want in their course before they decide on a textbook or other materials, because the textbook should not define your course design. Now, that being said, you're never going to find any existing materials that meet all your needs, so it's important to decide what are your priorities. If there are 4 things that are really, really important to you, and you find a textbook that does 3 of them really well, then maybe you just have to supplement the 4th one. But at least you know you're hitting your top 3. And then if you're thinking about developing your own materials, think carefully about how you'll resource that work and your timing. It can just be too much to do while you're trying to implement. One thing you may want to consider is starting out with existing materials and then starting to develop as you go along. Lastly, thinking about your training of faculty, and again, think long-term. Don't just think about what you do for the first year. These are issues that faculty often need training on. I want to highlight these 2 things here, bringing out mathematical ideas and not allowing the context to dominate. This is one of the downfalls of QR, and it's one of the things that will discourage faculty if they aren't prepared, is that the context can be so engaging that it overshadows the mathematical ideas. And it takes a lot of skill and practice to know how to help students bring the math out and understand the math that they're doing and not get so caught up in the context that that's all they talk about. So you want to help faculty be ready for that. You want to help them be ready for handling controversial issues that might arise in these contexts. And again, assessment, big, huge issue. Okay, so often there are doubts about rigor. If you're facing that either with math faculty or with partner disciplines, here's some things you might want to consider. You might bring in reviewers. Now, if you have resources, it's nice to do that, an external reviewer, but maybe it could be reviewers from other disciplines within your institution. You might collaborate across colleges. If there are a number of colleges in your region that are implementing QR courses, maybe you could all get together and review. And I put Mishmatic here just as a suggestion for people to think about, that since Mishmatic did have a workshop on QR, maybe there would be some continuing work through that organization on rigor. This is just another resource you can look at. It's a quantitative reasoning webinar we did for the state of Ohio. And we did have a faculty member from Ivy Tech on there talking about their development. So that's another recording you could look at. And then we have our contact information. And I'm 1 minute over on my time. So thanks to all of you that are either here live or watching the recording at a later date. As always, feel free to contact us if you have questions, and feel free to share that link with anyone that you want to help support your work.